Well done. You edited that film all by yourself. Well done. Congratulations. How did it feel? You saw it last year, I think you told me.
I saw it. Am I on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it during the Greenaway season that they held at the NFT.
Right.
I took my family to see it. I took my daughters, and they're only just about speaking to me.
Yes. It's a bit of a shock.
They did appear in it as 7-year-olds and 9-year-olds in one of the dinner scenes, which...
Oh, my goodness.
and my wife, Leslie, was in it as well.
Were you in it as well, Leslie?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, we were sitting on one of the tables. We took the girls away when it got
a bit violent, yeah.
The soup day was the day that they weren't allowed to be part of it.
I can well understand it. At this point, this was I think it's your 5th feature with Peter Greenaway. And so your first feature was The Draftsman's Contract with him, but in fact, you'd already worked with him as far as I could see. You'd done a couple of documentaries, Sandra Rhodes, Terence Conway.
Yeah, I met Peter at the Central Office of Information, where he was a film editor and I was a lowly assistant. And as things progressed with my time there, he gradually left to go and direct as a freelancer, but came back into the building to actually direct things for the COI, and we struck up a relationship there, and he actually used to request my presence, which was very kind. And we then reached the stage where all the editing department were being made redundant because of Thatcher's cuts to the operation there. And when I had sort of 6 months of waiting for redundancy, he said, "John, come and have lunch with me." He took me to lunch in Soho, put a script on the table and said, "I'd like you to cut this, my first feature." And I thought, well, what do I do? Sit about doing nothing for 6 months or not look a gift horse in the mouth? So I read it on a train journey to Scotland, and my mind was made up anyway.
And that was The Draftsman's Contract.
Yeah.
Interesting. He'd kind of done a feature-length film, I understand, called The Falls, which was 185 minutes of biographies of fictional composers apart from 2. And that's the kind of thing that one associates with Peter Greenaway. So it was all incipiently there. But evidently, this was a narrative film, The Draftsman's Contract. It's a bit different.
That was his first... Well, basically, the BFI came along and they had the money to make 3 feature films. The Draftsman's Contract was one. Gold was another one with Sally Potter. And Ascendancy with Ed Bennett was the third one. And I think the one that sort of really grabbed the imagination eventually was The Draftsman's Contract, perhaps more so than the other 2. And we were working on it for considerable time, and then one day somebody came in and said, "You run out of money. We're going to just have to stop." Then they showed it. We were being paid very minimal amounts of money all the way through the process. We had the same weekly fee for the lowly runners on the film as Janet Sussman was being paid, something like £150 a week. And then what happened is that Channel 4 asked to see the film. And so we showed it to them, and they said, "Okay, we will up the amount you're being paid, and we'll backdate it to when you started."
Wow!
So the gamble paid off.
Rent paid, and that started. That was his calling card. But one thing that wasn't on that calling card was Sacha Vierny, who was he was to join that's the cinematographer who was René's cinematographer, a very great figure, having filmed Hiroshima Mon Amour and Last Year at Marienbad,
which was Peter's favourite film. So he was working with someone he admired hugely,
and something of a paternal figure, I would have thought, because he was born 20 years before, easily. And that being the case, and the next film I think was Z and Two Noughts. that would mean that you were working quite closely with one of the great cinematographers of French films. How was that?
Well, he was a charming, delightful man. I think the best anecdote I can tell about him, apart from the one where he told Peter he can light anything with one candle, which, he proved to be right about, was the actual birth of The Cook. We were at the laboratories for Rank in Denham, having watched a print of Drowning by Numbers, sitting there having a cup of coffee. And Peter got out a napkin and said, Sacha Vianney was there, I was there, and Peter was there. For my next film, Sacha, I'm going to want to create a huge set, 3 different components, well, 4 including the lavatory part. And I want to do glue shots, which were the tracking shots that were travelling along, going behind black. So we basically, apart from the car park, we had one huge studio and kept, did a week in the restaurant, a week in the ante-room, a week in the kitchen or whatever. And Peter then said to Sacha, and I want the lighting to change in every room and all the costumes will change as well. And he scribbled that on a napkin, and that was how the film kind of started life.
Well, that's interesting. It's a visual inspiration.
Yeah.
Very early on. One of the things that you brought me straight to it. One of the things that struck me seeing the film again, which I didn't notice the first time I saw it, was editing is so much. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've never actually interviewed an editor before. So much about there's a strong element of continuity, and presumably you're looking to.
Yes.
So we all think that these cuts are from the same scene. And here you didn't have to bother about that at all because, well, you did and you didn't.
Well, I was looking at it and thinking how perfect a lot of the continuity was, given that we shot it with one camera. Now, of course, continuity is perfect because most of the films are shot 2, 3, 4 cameras at a time. Best example of that at the moment is Zone of Interest. You know about that?
Yes, there's multi-cameras.
They placed cameras all around the set for that, and so the continuity was perfect. I couldn't work out how these dogs were behaving so amazingly in that film, and they were running from one room to the next, and I thought, how do they do that? Because you never get animals to, and of course they had cameras shooting all the way.
Yeah, actually, I found it quite disturbing because the reverse shots, as I thought they were so perfect, and then I read afterwards that But here, you know, the costumes changing colours.
Yeah.
I mean, once upon a time, you might have had to match something, and here I read somewhere that he said that he found continuity boring.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. He would, so the Z2 is a good example of that. If you had an opportunity to have a couple of characters and to cut on a movement they made, he would say, no, don't do that. Just have them stop, move, and then cut. I want the audience to always see that it's a film and continuity has no part in films I make. However, my relationship with him went, because Peter was an editor, it went from him having quite a lot of control, and eventually by the time we got to The Cook, John sorted it out. So,
But what was sorting out? Because
well, the most controversial aspect that we came across in this film was the 180 degree cuts across the table, and that I did get worried about that, but now I see it in the fullness of time. Whenever you work on a film, it takes me at least 5 years before I look at it again with a fresh and sort of viewer's eye, and you can see now that it doesn't trouble me and it works fine.
What was the problem with that 100? Why did you?
It's not something that you should really do.
Because
it's a rule that you know, and rules are made to be broken. And I broke every rule in the book working with Peter before I became a normal editor.
But explain it to me. Is it because you can't?
Well, the backgrounds shift, like like that. I mean, it's the other cardinal sin is crossing the line, but that's clear where you've got if someone was filming me and you, and they didn't have the camera on the right person, you'd end up having me looking at, you'd be looking in the same direction as me, which would be absurd.
Yes.
So that's the cardinal sin that some people do get away with, committing it, but
It's interesting. Do you think he was doing this kind of stuff because he wasn't really interested, even though this has got a strong narrative?
Yeah. Well, that's the first film of his that had
one.
Had one, yeah.
Yes, I mean, Draftsman's Contract has a kind of a thriller aspect to it, but it's obviously very marginal. Whereas, have you got any idea why he decided to do that?
I do, in a way, because in the first 4 films that I worked with Peter, he was always being controlled by producers and being told what he could and couldn't do. When the script for The Cook was put out there, no one would touch it in this country. So it fell to Dutch producer and French producer, and they gave Peter virtual carte blanche to do what he liked. I mean, what he said, what was said in one of the newspaper reviews was that he virtually changed nothing from the shooting script, apart from the usual practicalities sometimes that can't be affected, and there were very few of those. And he said they even had the bonus of the 2 vans, which were like 2 Trojan horses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other reviews, it was Nigel Andrews, famous film critic from the Financial Times, contemporary review, saying that it was kind of tragic that this had to be financed not from this country at all. You've mentioned the Dutch and French money. He went round with the begging bowl green away, did he? Do you think?
Well, I guess, yeah. I know that while I was working on, I think it was on this project. There was a project I was working on where money didn't come through for 5, 6, 7 or 8 weeks, and Peter said to me, "John, if there's no money on Monday, you leave. You stop working." And that suitcase arrived full of money the next morning.
Lucky. But you this was as well as being, the culmination of your work with him over a period of years. It was also pretty much the last. Project.
Basically, when we didn't depart. I was basically in a partnership with him, business-wise as well, which was started off when we were asked to produce a TV version of Philip Glass's opera Satyagraha, and that sort of set that up. And then when we got to the point where I would be needing to look for work after The Cook, Peter went off to do a painting exhibition somewhere or an opera or something. He was multifaceted like that. And I got offered Young Soul Rebels, and he said, "Oh, take it, for goodness sake." And I had the unusual experience of when Prospero's books came out, Peter asked me, he said, "Would you like to come and see it?" I said, "I'd love to see it." And I thought, this is the first time I've actually sat in a cinema to watch something that Peter's done for the screen that I haven't been involved with.
And then your joint careers, as often happens, took you in.
Yeah, absolutely. That seemed a good point after that lapse to just move on to whatever else.
Had it been your intention in the Central Office of Information? Does it? Such a young audience. Do you know what the Central Office of Information was? You don't. I'm very glad. I remember it, but I would. Could you explain what the Central Office of Information?
There was what we called a home side, and there was an overseas side, and the film editing part of it was the overseas side. And we made 10-minute weekly programs to show in Africa, which were always in black and white. Paul Boateng, who went on to become a Labour cabinet minister, was one of the presenters. We also made This Week in Britain, which was 5-minute films about things that happen regularly in Britain, like fashion shows. Basically, the whole purpose was to sell Britain abroad, and the other thing was Living Tomorrow, which was a kind of British version of Tomorrow's World, where all the inventions had to be British. You'd hardly be able to make that program now, but
it's very interesting. I mean, you might see it at Central Office of Information as being a bit of a parallel to the BBC World Service, as a way of telling the world about that.
They were certainly bigger handlers of film than even the BBC at one point. So it was a big operation.
Yes, very interesting. And when you were there, had it been your intention to become a feature film editor, or with your other hat on to become a television
that's very
editor?
interesting, because I was doing, all the things I was doing there were documentary based. And so I suppose when Peter said, would you like to try your hand at the Draftsman's Contract? I thought, oh, drama, I'll give that a go. And actually, to be quite honest, I thought, easy after documentaries. And I still have great admiration for documentaries, because that's the hardest form, really, of editing. Because you've got to create something from nothing, really. You have a script with a drama, with a feature film.
It's footage.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the narrative emerges.
Yeah.
Assuming there is a narrative.
Well, yeah.
It emerges from the footage. Funny you should mention documentaries. I saw this documentary about the making of Midnight Cowboy. I then went back to the book, which I've got, that it's based on. There's a quote from an editor in there, which is that an editor, as well as wielding a pair of deft scissors, sometimes has to negotiate with the director on the footage that they think they've shot rather than the footage that they've actually shot. Have you had that?
It happens with just about every production, yeah. They'll always say to you, where's that shot that I did on such and such an afternoon? I said, I haven't been able to find it anywhere. And it'll usually be something that was a rehearsal and didn't get shot, or was decided to be dropped after it was rehearsed.
But with this guy, you just can't imagine that.
No, he would have everything planned ahead.
Did he storyboard, or was it nothing as crude as that?
Well, any storyboards would have been done only by him, because he was obviously a painter by trade before he got into filmmaking. So yeah, he was not by trade. That sounds like he was being paid early on, but he's always been a fine artist. And any drawings that were done were not necessarily for any. I mean, these days the storyboards are for major action sequences, unless somebody's really unsure and wants to do the entire film. So yeah, Peter wasn't one for. He had it all in his head, and he was, while you were cutting with him, he was planning his next 2 movies.
Ah, that's interesting. And but presumably were you doing rushes in the traditional way?
Oh yeah. I mean, we had Z2 Noughts, for example. We shot in Holland, and I was there for 3 months, and the measures trying to get to see the rushes projected. We ended up in a building where we were projecting them onto a brick wall, which they had painted white for us. So it was pretty rudimentary, but was important. And we on every one of his films, we would often have a lunch hour to look at what had been put together, from the day before. The only exception was Belly of an Architect, where everything was shot in Italy. They didn't see fit to have the editor over there, so it all came back to England, and I had to sort of start from scratch, which is, not the most useful time. I mean, it's fine for me. I get the time to do it, but I mean, you don't usually expect that, because the whole idea is to have the editor cutting as you shoot. Yeah. And we had a cutting room at Elstree for this. We had 2 cutting rooms, one opposite each other in the corridor. In the next door building, the first Batman film had 18 cutting rooms, so we kind of knew who was the lower budget project.
I see. Did you have, in your long career, have you ever had 18 cutting rooms yourself?
Nope.
Oh, well.
I think about 4 is about the most I've had.
Oh, well, it's still time to come. Yeah, very good. You've got a film editor here. How often does that happen? Does anybody have any questions about editing, or yes, or yes, they're coming, or this film in particular.
Hello, yeah, I just wanted to get some idea of what kind of coverage you'd get back, what Peter would shoot, and actually answer that question.
Yeah, well, basically it was pretty sort of tight. There was no wading through miles and miles of outtakes and footage. It was pretty, I would say, probably in terms of cutting ratios, the strictest. I mean, the smallest I've come across. So it was fine on that front, actually. But I still had to make decisions. You noticed some of those scenes were basically the scene which gave us coming back to me looking at the film now. What gave us the biggest problem was the scene where Georgina is persuading Richard to cook him at the table there, because we had take after take of Richard Boranger being almost impossible to understand. And even now, I mean, you've got to be listening carefully and get used to him. But on that scene, we basically had a close-up of the two of them and a wide shot. And I don't remember there being a huge amount of takes to choose from there. So it was kind of, picking bits from various places and working out where you had to go wide and so on. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I was going to ask about how many takes did you tend to get for each setup? Because obviously you had these really nice long kind of masters.
Yeah, they were pretty low, I would say. Certainly to get up to 7 or 8 would be very unusual. But that's my memory. We're talking what?
35 years.
Something like that, yeah.
Yesterday. Yeah. So you had in front here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was quite surprised by your comment that you cut as you shoot. I didn't kind of expect that to be the case. How does it work in practice? Because you probably don't, do you cut and see then the entire scene, and somehow that informs the decisions of what to shoot next? And what's the practical reason for that?
The practical side of it is that it's my job while they're filming to put the film together from what they shoot. And therefore, I would put in every single angle, this is not so relevant to Peter Greenaway's films, but in general terms, in films I've done since, you would put together, make sure all the shot. This is my view of doing it. Others have different views, but I would put everything that was shot, because I've seen how long it takes for every setup to happen on a film. So they've obviously done those setups for a reason. So I put that together and make the film play whilst, I do it so that at the end of, say, a week, I'll send the director what I've done that week, and they'll look at it, and if there's anything controversial, I'll do it, straight away, and they'll look at it and decide they need to do another pickup, because sometimes you're only on a location for maybe a couple of days, 3 days. So they need to know pretty quickly whether there's likely to be a need to do any pickup shots. What Peter used to do in the good film, to exemplify this, was Drowning by Numbers, where he knew he had to do a lot of close-ups of the various numbers as they appeared throughout the film, and set aside, several days for pickup shoots. And then a pickup shoot became vital to putting together the bits that were missing, if you like. So yeah, it's my job is to cut it as we go, show it. The most nerve-wracking moment for any director is to see what I've put together, or any editor's put together, and then they come in and we work together and we start from scratch in a way, because we've now got the script in film form rather than script form, and we proceed from there.
One of the things that struck me about this film, and indeed all his work, something like this with these long tracking shots, the average shot length is probably greater, and you probably have fewer cuts in his films than
that's
in
true.
every subsequent film you've ever done.
That's certainly true, yeah. But it's not about how many cuts you have. It's where you cut, as I've often said to students who ask me that question. How do you know when to edit? You know?
How do you know? That's a good question. Yes, a question. And wait for the microphone to reach you, and here it is, coming your way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I have a question is that aside from like the long theatrical like shots, I noticed there's one thing is that there's a lot of like cross-cutting between, for example, like the first like sex scene is like the like what happened between the couple, and then like the close up of like the cooking scene, or like things that's like what's happening in a restaurant and what's happening in the kitchen. I'm wondering with like, because it sounds like Peter is like very like controlling director, but I'm like curious, is this kind of like showing what's happening in what like space, like this kind of cross-cutting is like, is it already like
that's a very
planned,
good question. It had to be pretty planned, because we would have, as I said earlier, a week in the kitchen, a week in the restaurant, and a week in the lavatories, and then once you've got that, it had been de-rigged, so it was impossible to go back and do any more. So he knew what he was doing there, and so that was planned.
I've got just quick. Are you prior to basically in prep? Are you involved with Peter in kind of shot listing, or
very little?
The pace of this is so controlled by the length of the shots, as you're saying.
Yeah.
So, and then the moments that
I'd say very little. I've only ever been brought onto a film, which was The Book Thief, where I was brought onto it about a week before. And also on Me Before You, I had to cut a sequence, and then the actor had to go away and bulk up. No, not bulk up, the opposite, had to get skinnier, yeah. So sometimes you have that to call upon, but they don't pay you in between. They just say come back 3 weeks' time on the sort of budgets I work on.
More? Yes, there's at least two.
Hello. Musically, how are you guys working together? Because obviously music's so integral to the whole vision of his films.
Well, Michael Nyman was a delight, because he would, right from the word go on the Draftsman's contract, he would provide us with piano temp tracks. So I had music to edit with, which is such a delight. Gary will know about that, because, the composer is always brought on, usually far too late, in my opinion.
And you normally get not the composer's temp.
Exactly. I mean, we do. I work with John Williams, for example, and the closest we could get was to use other tracks of his from other films he's done, which puts you in the right ballpark, I guess. But with Michael Nyman, all the way through on except the one film that Michael didn't do, which was Belly of an Architect, which had its colourful musical life, because we had Wim Mertens, who was a Dutch composer, and then we had Glenn Branca. And I don't know if many of you know the Olympic Cinema down in Barnes. Now, that was Olympic Studios in the days when we were making that film. And we went down there one morning to hear Glenn Branca's music. And the producer of the film called Peter to one side and said, "We can't have this music. He's got to go." So he was sacked. But one of his tracks did stay in the film, what we'd recorded that morning.
I'm sure he was very happy about that.
But yeah, with Michael Nyman, we had, on the other 4 films, we had guide tracks of his melodies, and all on a piano with a click track. So it was kind of like a gift, really. Do
you like editing? Have you
yes,
generally edited?
I love it.
That's how you do it.
It's my forte. Well, I hope it's my forte. I mean, that last scene, I must tell you the anecdote about that last scene when they walk the body into the restaurant. For some reason, our sound recordist had not crystal linked his sound record, his Nagra, which is basically making sure that everything that's done to playback will synchronize with the pictures you see. So on that particular sequence, it didn't synchronize perfectly. So I spent about a day cutting a frame out every second of the magnetic soundtrack to make sure, and also making sure I didn't hold the shots before they started slightly out of step and ended. I've watched it to this day, slightly out of step and ended slightly out of step, but it's subtle enough to work enough with the music for you to watch, see where the cut happens. But yeah, those are quirks that happen when you are let down occasionally.
Well, I definitely didn't notice that, John, so well done you. Now, you had a question, as I think. It's this... Oh, hello. You're going to have to wait your turn. So. There you are. There you go.
Hi, sorry, that was my question about the music anyway. But I've got a reserve. So
well done.
which is the most kind of proud? Which movie are you proudest of in terms of the greener ways that you've done, and for what reason?
Gosh, that's a really difficult question to answer. It's probably this one, primarily because I thought it's great that Peter's at last got international recognition from it, because it was by far his, well, up to that point in his career certainly, and probably even since, his most sort of successful film. He had problems in America with it, in that they wanted to... I had a contact from Harvey Weinstein's brother. I've forgotten his name, but he got in touch with me, and I had to do a completely bowdlerized version of the film, and then they wouldn't pay me. I had to ask them a couple of times to get the money over to me, but it was totally absurd. It was like an airline version. You can imagine trying to do that with this material.
It was the idea just to shorten it or to take all the naughty bits out.
Bit of each.
Yeah.
Well, mainly naughty bits, yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, that was... I can't imagine.
I know. I can't remember what I did now at all. Can't remember.
But you mentioned this thing about it having been... It probably was, financially at least, but also in terms of prestige, the most successful, because is it fair to say he went on to become increasingly more controversial?
Oh, absolutely. And that's because he'd been given this leeway without a hand, keeping him sort of on the right side of good. And then, The Baby of Macon has upset an awful lot of people when it came out.
Excellent. He's one of those figures of which there are so unfortunately few in British artistic life, where it's interesting, he and Derek Jarman were born the same year. Jarman was a couple of months older, I think, and they are both very iconoclastic figures, people quite difficult to categorise. And if Jarman hadn't tragically died, I'm sure he'd still be annoying the hell out of people. So your alliance with this particular... have you worked with anybody like that since?
Well, I went on straight away working on this with Isaac Julian, who has moved into... I went to see one of his exhibitions at the Tate
another renegade,
Yeah, he's a complete renegade. I don't think there's anybody else as renegade-ish, if that's a word, as that. I can't think of anybody else.
And also you found an interesting direction going into TV, which I suppose was probably unexpected.
Yeah, I always was a bit sceptical about television, and I reached the point where I'd had a few successful features, and I very pompously said, I'll only do a TV show if it's going to be good and I'm going to really like it. And Downton Abbey came along, and Brian Percival, who I met for the first time on that and then had quite a long relationship with after that. It was fascinating with that because we shot the stately room shots, up in the house, the grand shots, all big wide shots. And ITV came back to us and said, "This is much too cinematic," which I thought was, total praise. And Brian said to them, look, wait till next week when we're downstairs in the hurly-burly of the kitchens. It's going to be handheld and we're going to be up close. And as soon as they saw that cut together, they just went away and let us get on with it.
God, it's terrifying, isn't it? You never know when some suit is going to execute you. It really quite terrifying. Are there any other questions? Oh, yeah. I'm allowing you another one since nobody else is here. Nobody else's hand is up anyway.
This is based on something that I read about The Cook the Thief when I watched it the first time, which is that it's sort of allegorical for he's the Tory Prime Minister and she's the population of the country, or the restaurant is that something that was in your mind and Greenaway's mind whilst
Greenaway would have had that in his mind before he even wrote it, I would think, because he would have his. I would sit there in the cutting room and he would give me these allegorical facts about what the film was driving at. The other one was that the whole of that set is like the alimentary canal, with the food going in the restaurant and coming out in the car park. But it was meant to be the most popular assessment of it was a look at Thatcherite Britain and the greed and corruption that was going on in politics. Does that sound familiar?
Alas, but it was, yeah, and it was also when I watched it again for the first time for this thing, because I've seen it a few times since, I started to think about other films that were being made or had been made recently, and something like Wall Street came to mind. It's the age of conspicuous consumption. There's a reference that is it Gambon's character speaker? I can't remember. Somebody makes a reference to the Ethiopian famine in it, which at the time was very much on everybody's mind, and it's just a glancing mention in this, which is, I think, fairly typical of the way that he would bury that stuff. But that's at the back of it, I think, all these people stuffing their faces and the rest of the world starving. Quite, very powerful. Another thing, since I'm on a roll here, there's the thing about style over substance, which is something that was often thrown at him, I think, and still is, the idea that the look of the thing is more important in some way than other things. That was also something going on elsewhere. I was thinking of Jean-Jacques Benéix and Diva, and Richard Boranger was in Diva and was in Subway,
right,
I think, the Luc Besson film, or this Cinéma du Luc, which was big, and Betty Blue and all this.
Well, I mean, Peter was absolutely obsessed with the look of the films, and I remember him getting a tape measure and doing the Rushes screening and going up to the screen and saying that pillar needs to be is too close to the edge of the frame. We've got to change that and do it again this afternoon. I mean, he would be symmetria omnia est was his, which of course is a.
It's interesting. He was there was Jarman is another example. There was a zeitgeist. The look of the film would have a significance in terms of the meaning of the whole film that it didn't have, say, in more conventional fare. I'm thinking of a film like Rumblefish, even Coppola, and how interestingly visual that is in a way that you just don't get now anyway.
Well, go and see Poor Things if you want to see something.
Oh yeah, Lanthimos.
I mean, amazingly visually interesting movie.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good example. It's still going on, where the visual, there's a kind of visual truth, which is not separate.
I mean, it's an example of every department winning.
Yeah,
I'd say.
Yes, as opposed to subduing themselves underneath some other thing. Yeah, no, very good. Yes, you're coming in for your number 2, and then I'll wrap up, I think.
Thank you. Speaking of visual representations, the movie looks very much like a painting. Every shot is a picture, and the way the food is arranged is not how food would be arranged in reality, right? And the way the restaurant is decorated and what they're wearing is also not like it. What is the story behind?
Well, the Frans Hals painting, which has got a long title, but I can't remember it all, which is the backdrop in the restaurant, was obviously the guidelines for the rather Jacobean-like costumes that both Speaker and all his henchmen were wearing. And I did read somewhere that that was representing one period in history, whereas, you know, the car park was a more modern period. And and then the loos were the most modern, you know, in terms of fashion and so on. So I mean, it's not an easy one to get your head round, really. You know, it's a problematic thing to analyse with him.
My instinct is not to pin these things down. I mean, for example, the idea that the restaurant is the mouth and the car park is the toilet, well, or whether, you know, where the food ends up at the end of the thing. But where do the toilets, which are right next to the dining room, where all that activity takes place, it doesn't really hang together.
No, he was obsessed with sex, death, and you know, and scatological matters. I'm going to say he was obsessed with that, but it seemed to.
I suppose it's to do with the basic human
functions.
Our animal selves. And
he always used to say too that you never believe sex on the screen. You just never. I don't know why it is even done, because it's just not real. So what's the point?
Yeah. Oh, there's a whole other discussion there.
What I'd like to know quickly is how many people here have never seen this film before? My God.
Fantastic. I'm so glad that you saw it tonight. It
staggers me. Oh, well, that's great.
I'm really, really thrilled that we were able to share this for you. There's lots more Peter Greenaway, lots more John Wilson. Thank you for coming tonight.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. Thank you.